Before I was ever a storyteller, I was a writer. Now, the life of a writer might sound a romantic one to some people. I mean, you do get to sleep in until noon every day if you want to. No one expects you to shave. But it's kind of a lonely life, to be honest. I mean, so many times you're just sat there, staring at a blank screen or a blank piece of paper, and the emptiness just seems to stare right back at you, as though it was saying, you know, you really are a very bad writer. You struggle, you hesitate and agonize over every choice of word. And sometimes you end up just crossing out the whole thing and wishing you'd become a web designer instead. And even when you do manage to write a few pages each day, there's no telling if it's any good or not. I mean, if you're a carpenter, you can make a table that you can stand on to see if it's strong. If you're a bus driver, you know if you arrive to your destination in time. But a writer can work all day and end up with something that's only good for lighting the fire. And even if you do write something good, there's no guarantee it'll get published. And forget about making any money, by the way. And even if it does get published, it might not be read for years by anybody. And you never get to meet your readers. On second thoughts, that might be quite a good thing. Because when you come across a book that you like, I mean, this writer, they take on the status of a god to you, no? They've created a world in which you both believe. So what a disappointment to finally meet the writer and discover that they're an opinionated, awkward nerd with bad breath and terrible dress sense. Unpopular, self-conscious, grandiose. The reason most writers become writers is because they can't deal with the real world in the first place. So why do we bother? Well, there's a secret. A secret that's known to every writer, or poet, or playwright, that there's nothing like the thrill of creation. From nothing comes something. From the emptiness, from the void, there emerges a form, an idea, a story. And for a brief, fleeting moment, you really do feel like a god. I mean, you can make it rain in a single sentence. You can give birth or kill off characters at will. I'm not perhaps being entirely honest, though. All writers are liars. You should know that. I think lying is one of the very first creative things that we do in our lives. Because I think really, writing is much more the process of discovery than creation. If you ever put a coin beneath a bit of paper and you take a pencil and you sketched on top to see the outline emerge, well, I think writing is something like that. Take your characters, for instance. Maybe you have a character in your story who walks with a limp and you don't know why. But you ask your pen and you find out that he was hit by a car one day when the driver was distracted by a beautiful girl on a street corner. Well, you didn't know it before, but now it's already happened. It's history and you couldn't change it if you wanted to. Or take your characters in the stories. They have their nature and you can't change that. The priest can't become a bad guy unless it was in there somehow from the beginning. And the town drunk, well, he can't help himself but reach for the bottle and take another drink. So it would seem evident somehow that all the characters are reflections of your own mind, part of you somehow. Unless, perhaps, one of them gets away. And then the whole process is just turned upside down. Some years ago, I got fixated upon this idea that you weren't a real writer until you had written a novel. I looked at my bookshelf and I saw all the greats there, Dostoevsky, Nabokov, and Mervyn Peake, and I wanted my name to be up there too, to write something that would be studied by school kids long after I was dead. But everything I tried to do came out just as a pale copy of all of those greats, a ghostly echo of all the books that had inspired me to become a writer in the first place. And I really began to question if I had it in me. But I sat down every morning, afternoon and night to write, and as the weeks and months passed, slowly, my novel emerged out of the mist. And I could taste the autumn air my pen described as I set my novel in 19th century Bohemia. And I could hear the voices of the characters in my novel like they were old friends. I based the hero, Tomasz, on the better parts of myself. Handsome, intelligent, charming. It was no wonder that Lucia, the heroine of the story, was so much in love with him. I'd based Lucia on my best friend in real life, Lucy, with whom I'd been rather tragically in love for several years, though she made it quite clear that she'd rather just keep me as a friend. And she would come and cry on my shoulder every time her relationships went wrong, but it never seemed to go any further than that. But all that changed when I was holding the pen. I began to lay down layer upon layer of plot in my novel like folds of phyllo pastry. All of the characters dancing to the tune of my pen. All of them, except one. Raphael. He was just a minor character, an anarchist who was supposed to try and kill the president and die trying on page 146. But I had trouble with him from the beginning. I didn't like the way he dressed, first of all, always with a cheap second-hand suit smelling of cheap laundry, and his hair was always uncombed and unwashed, and he had this look on his face like he knew something that nobody else did. But I couldn't have changed him. That's just the way he was. I mean, he did what he was supposed to do, and he said what I told him to say. He went where I told him to go, but it was all with a certain reluctance. Yeah, he would yawn whilst declaring his anarchist principles. He'd pick his nails whilst telling how he was going to assassinate the president. And even when I wrote his dialogue, it was like my pen was going through sand. And as the novel went on, Raphael became increasingly restless. He started chain smoking until his fingertips turned yellow. He would walk into a room and check every door and window to see if someone was listening in, which, was understandable behaviour for an anarchist with a bomb in his pocket. But Raphael took it to extremes. He would sometimes spin around in the middle of a room to see if somebody was coming up behind him. He even learned to sleep with his eyes open. Well, at last we came to page 146, and Raphael was sat in a tea house in Prague, opposite a Russian agitator called Romanov. Outside in the street, they could hear their presidential procession approaching as he came to visit all the main streets of Prague. Romanov looked at Raphael, and he pushed a paper package across the table. "Now, my friend, now is the moment to strike."
"Now is indeed the moment to strike. But the one I want to get at is far beyond my reach."
What? Raphael wasn't supposed to say that. I made Romanov grab his sleeve, but before he could say anything, Raphael took out a knife from his pocket, stabbed the Russian in the neck. And as the blood poured out and the sound of the drums grew louder in the street outside, Raphael looked up at the author and walked off the page. I stared at the words I had just written in horror. I wanted to cross it all out, but that would be like pretending yesterday had never happened. It was already history. Well, I made myself a strong drink and went for an early night. But I slept badly. All night I kept dreaming of that strange, evil smile that Raphael had, and what did it mean he'd walked off the page? Was that supposed to be some kind of threat? I woke up in the morning and the phone was ringing. I answered it, but it took me a full 2 minutes to understand who I was talking to. It was my agent. And he wanted to ask me how the novel was coming along. I said, yeah, fine. It's coming along nicely. It's a work in progress. And then I had to suffer an hour-long lecture about how he had negotiated me a nice advance on the expectation I would meet my deadlines. Publishers, after all, did have a right to expect a manuscript when they asked for it. I apologized over and over, and only after an hour he let me go. I went on downstairs to the study, and with a cup of coffee, I sat down on my manuscript to see how I could try to fix things. I suppose I could always find somebody else to kill the president. There was no shortage of anarchists after all. The important thing now was to make sure that Tomasz and Lucia came together. Their marriage would unite their families and ensure a happy ending for all of those who deserved it. The sun rose on the fashionable part of town where Tomasz kept his bachelor apartment. But the curtains were closed even at this late morning hour. And the servants hurried up the stairs and burst into their master's room to find him lying on the carpet in a pool of blood, a dagger wound in his side. They ran to call for a doctor, but Tomasz said no, and reaching towards the mantelpiece, they understood that in his dying moments, all he wanted was to hold the portrait of Lucia close to him. But horror! The painting had been torn from the frame. Heaving a terrible cry of anguish, Tomasz died upon the carpet. Not Tomasz. What would Lucia do without him? But it was only then that I noticed the 2 cigarette butts stubbed out on the mantelpiece. The maid walked up the stairs in Lucia's house with a breakfast tray in her hands. She rapped twice on the door, but receiving no answer, she pushed it open, intending to leave the breakfast for her lady for when she woke up. But the room was empty. Empty except for a purple envelope upon the table, next to an overflowing ashtray. She scooped the letter up and ran downstairs to where Lucia's parents were having breakfast in the drawing room. Moments later, the house was in chaos. Lucia, it seemed, had eloped, run away with some rascal called Raphael, with whom she declared herself to be madly in love. Her mother began fainting on the carpet, while her father called for the police. fiction had become the stuff of horror. Imagination had turned to nightmare. What kind of a man would kill somebody and then steal his girl? He'd probably taken the family jewels on the way out. Even now, he was probably seducing Lucia on a boat going slowly down the Danube. Oh, and the thought of his yellow fingernails digging into her pure white flesh. It was more than I could bear. I could not write this story. I would not write it. Picking up my manuscript. 6 months of work. I carried it out to the garden and made a fire. And like they were pieces of used toilet paper, I dropped the sheets in, one by one, until there was nothing left but a pile of ashes. But at least now I'd be free of Raphael once and for all. But in the weeks that followed, I grew increasingly restless. I started smoking, and I had this terrible sensation that somebody was watching or listening in. A few times I even span around to see if somebody was creeping up behind me. Imagining perhaps I was suffering from an overactive imagination, I started writing again. This time short stories where I was sure nothing could go wrong. I wrote the story of a Russian family on a rare day off, heading to the forest to pick mushrooms. A day of bonding between father and son and mother and daughter. And they returned home in the evening with 2 baskets full of fresh mushrooms, only to discover their house had burned down. Giving up on that story, I started another tale of a young man who left a life of privilege to go to a poor village to educate the children there and give them a chance in life. But though he dedicated himself to their education and worked every hour God sent, he found opinion turned against him in the village one day, when a stranger had been in town. A stranger spreading rumours about him, suggesting the reason the young teacher had never married was because he was a bit too fond of the children he taught. Turning in desperation to poetry, I began a short poem about a 7-year-old girl who only learnt the meaning of what it was to love when she was given a kitten for her birthday. She woke up early one morning as the stars faded and the sun was dawning. I didn't say it was good poetry. I was just happy to be writing at all. She pushed the kitchen door open wide, and behold, thick tears, she cried. For pinned to the wall, staining red, was her kitten with a knife through its head. Who do you go to when one of your characters turns against you? A psychologist? A priest? A publisher? I went instead to find a colleague, a novelist of several successful books, who taught a class on Russian literature up at the local university. I caught him between classes, and he listened to my story, and he said, "Well, if you ask me, it sounds like he lives in you as much as you do in him. Have it out with him, like a man." I took his advice. I went home and I took out everything sharp in the kitchen and locked it in a box. I disconnected the gas in case Raphael might try to organize an explosion. And then I walked into my study and took out my pen. I found myself walking along the streets of a city in winter. The wind chased dead leaves through the gutter, and the sun shone brightly but too low to cast any heat. I walked down the broken steps to a basement bar. The place was empty, as I knew it would be, and the bartender served me my whiskey without having to be asked. I took it and turned to the corner where Raphael was waiting for me, as I knew he would be. I took my seat opposite him, and for the longest time we stared at each other, not saying a word. Finally, I asked, "What did you do with Lucia?"
What did she do to herself, you mean? I grew tired of her. When I tell her I don't love her, she says she throw herself in the river.
And?
It's surprising how fast a woman can drown.
I wanted to lean forward and punch him on the nose, but then I remembered he always carried a knife. What is it you want?
What do I want? My friend, do you know what it is like to be told what to do, where to go, what to say?
But you walked off the page.
Yes, but this place is not real. I am not real. You, my friend, are not real.
I don't understand.
That's the problem. You are dumb like hero in your story. You want whole world to love you.
What is it you want?
My friend, I cannot be free until you are.
That conversation happened over 10 years ago now. The changes came slowly, and they began with words, as you might expect from a writer. When the telephone rang a few days later, my agent wanted to know where the hell the book was. I told him to go fuck himself. And a few days later, I met Lucy in the street, and she came running up to me and started to pour out the latest heartbreak tale she'd had of her no-good boyfriend. And I told her that if she wanted somebody who only listened and never talked, she might as well marry a dog. And so, as I began to say things I'd never said, do things I'd never done, I began to write again. And this time with a new sense of freedom. I never knew what my characters might do or say next. I surprised them, and in time, they surprised me. As for Raphael, I wonder where he is now. Tell you the truth, I miss him. After all, without him, I never could have walked off the page.